Frostbite took fingers and toes before bullets did. We wrapped our feet in rags, we rubbed each other's. They say war is fire and fury. Explosions, bullets, men charging through smoke. But Bastogne was something else entirely. It was ice. It was silence. It was hunger gnawing at your gut until you forgot what full felt like. It was the cold, unrelenting, merciless cold. My name is Richard Callahan, Private First Class 101st Airborne Division. Winter 1944. The Ardennes Forest. Bastogne. The Battle of the Bulge. I was 19 years old, a boy wearing a man's uniform with a rifle that felt heavier with every frozen step. When people talk about war, they imagine the fighting. But the real war, the one that breaks you, is the waiting. And in Bastogne, we waited in the snow, surrounded, freezing, starving, praying for relief that never seemed to come. We'd been rushed in after the Germans launched their surprise offensive. They came pouring through the Ardennes like a flood, smashing through thin lines of defense. Our orders were clear. Hold Bastogne. No retreat. No surrender. Bastogne was the crossroads. Lose it, and the whole front could unravel. The trucks brought us as close as they could before the roads became impassable. The rest of the way we marched. Snow up to our calves, the icy wind slicing through our thin wool uniforms like knives. Most of us didn't have proper winter gear. No parkas, no boots built for the snow, just the same jackets and leggings we'd worn in the fall. Our breath froze in the air as we stumbled forward, rifles slung low, eyes stinging from the wind. When we finally reached the town, it didn't feel like salvation. It felt like a coffin. The place was half ruined already, buildings shattered from shelling, windows blown out. Civilians huddled in basements, their faces pale and hollow. The smell of smoke and damp stone clung to everything. We dug in fast. Foxholes in the frozen ground. If you've never tried digging in December earth, let me tell you, it isn't soil. It's concrete. We hacked with shovels, bayonets, even our helmets until we carved out something barely big enough to crawl into. You lay there at night with your knees pressed to your chest, trying to convince yourself you were warm, that your feet weren't freezing solid inside your boots. The first shells came that evening. The Germans knew exactly where we were. The whine of incoming artillery became the soundtrack of Bastogne. You'd hear that rising scream, then the world would explode in fire and snow. Trees shattered like matchsticks, showers of frozen splinters raining down. Men huddled in their holes, whispering prayers, waiting for the next one to land. But the shells weren't the worst of it. The cold was. It crept into your bones, into your blood. It stole your strength. Frostbite took fingers and toes before bullets did. We wrapped our feet in rags, we rubbed each other's hands, but it was never enough. You could feel it, your body slowly shutting down, one frozen breath at a time. And through it all, we waited. Supplies couldn't reach us. The Germans had us surrounded, every road cut off. Ammunition was low, food was scarce. Some days we ate nothing but a handful of frozen beans from a busted ration tin. Hunger made us lightheaded. The cold made us numb. I remember one night in particular, the shelling had stopped. The forest was quiet, the snow falling soft and steady. I was huddled in my foxhole, rifle across my chest, when I heard singing. Faint, shaky, carried on the icy wind. It was one of our boys, didn't even know who, murmuring a hymn. Abide with me. His voice cracked, thin and trembling, but it carried across the line. One by one, others picked it up. The sound spread, fragile but defiant, a prayer whispered against the frozen dark. That was Bastogne. Not just fear, not just suffering, but men freezing and starving, still finding the strength to sing into the night. And the Germans, they were listening too. The next morning the snow had stopped, but the silence was worse than the shelling. No birds, no movement, just the sound of men's teeth chattering as we huddled in our foxholes. Bastogne wasn't just cold, it was suffocating. Surrounded on all sides, we knew every breath could be our last. Word spread fast. The Germans had completely cut us off. We were an island in a sea of enemy troops. No supplies, no reinforcements. Just us, the 101st, and whatever grit we had left. Some men cursed. Some laughed like it was a joke. Most of us just went quiet. We all knew what it meant. By midday they came. Infantry in gray coats, rifles slung, advancing through the snow. At first they looked like shadows moving between the trees. Then the gunfire cracked. The forest lit up with muzzle flashes and the air filled with the flat, snapping sound of bullets. We fired back from our holes, rifles jerking against our shoulders, the recoil lost in frozen numbness. You'd think the cold would dull fear. It didn't. It sharpened it. Every sound echoed. Every bullet seemed closer. I remember the snow flying up inches from my face, the sting of powder in my nostrils. My hands shook so badly I thought I'd drop my rifle, but somehow I held on. The fighting lasted hours, maybe more. Time blurred in Bastogne. Minutes stretched into eternities, then disappeared. We pushed them back, but not without cost. Hendricks, a boy from Kentucky, took a round through the leg. They dragged him to a cellar in town where our medics worked in the dark with no morphine left. His screams cut through the night until his voice gave out. That was the rhythm of Bastogne. Attack, shelling, silence, repeat. And all the while the cold pressing down harder, squeezing the life from us. Our foxholes became graves we climbed in and out of each day. On the third day, something happened that's burned into my memory. A runner came through the line, breath steaming, cheeks raw from the wind. He carried a message from the German commander. It was an ultimatum. Surrender, or be annihilated. We all looked at each other. Was this it? Was it over? I'll never forget the way Captain Winters read the message aloud. His face was calm, his voice steady, but his eyes burned. He passed the note along and we waited. Hours later, word came back from General McAuliffe himself. One word. Just one. Nuts. That was it. Our answer to surrender. No speeches, no long explanations, just nuts. The words spread through the line, whispered like a secret, then shouted, then laughed. We didn't have food. We didn't have winter gear. We barely had ammo. But we had that word, and somehow it was enough. The Germans didn't take it well. The shelling intensified, mortars, artillery, rockets. The forest became a furnace of fire and ice. Trees shattered, snow churned into red slush. Men screamed, men prayed, men fired blindly into the smoke. I clutched my rifle and whispered a prayer of my own. Not for victory, not even for survival, just for one more sunrise. One more chance to draw breath and see the light break through the smoke, and in that frozen hell I wasn't alone. Around me, in every foxhole, every ruined house, every shattered tree line, men were praying too. Different words, different gods, but the same desperate hope. We weren't just fighting the Germans, we were fighting the hunger, the cold, the dark. Fighting the silence that told us no one was coming. But deep down we held on to one fragile truth. Reinforcements had to come, because if they didn't, Bastogne would be our grave. Nights in Bastogne were the worst. The cold deepened until it felt like the air itself was trying to kill you. You'd sit in your hole, knees pulled to your chest, teeth chattering so hard you worried they'd break. Sleep wasn't rest. It was surrender. If you let yourself drift, the cold crept in and you might never wake up. We burned anything we could find, bits of wood, scraps of paper, even enemy gear. But the fires had to be small, hidden. Too much smoke, and the Germans would zero in on us. So mostly we just shivered and prayed for dawn. Food was running out fast. Rations had been scarce before the encirclement, but now we were down to scraps. Some guys boiled snow just to trick their stomachs into thinking they'd eaten. Others gnawed on frozen bread so hard it cracked teeth. I watched one man dig into his pocket, pull out a Hershey bar he'd been saving since Normandy, and split it 4 ways between his buddies. The way they ate it, you'd think it was the body of Christ itself. Ammo was no better. Each man counted bullets like they were gold coins. Every shot fired was a choice. Save your skin now or maybe die later when you had nothing left. Some of us joked about throwing rocks if it came to it. No one laughed too hard. Then came the wounded. Every day more were dragged back from the line. Men pale from blood loss, groaning, begging for morphine we didn't have. The medics worked in barns and cellars, hands shaking from cold and exhaustion, praying their bandages would hold. I still remember the smell, blood, sweat, and that sickly sweet rot of infection. You could hear it too, the ragged breathing, the prayers, the screams when knives cut flesh without anesthetic. Doc Jensen, our medic, carried a little book of psalms. When the bandages ran out, when the pain was too much, he'd just sit with the wounded reading in a calm, steady voice. Sometimes the words worked better than the medicine. Sometimes not. On the sixth night, the shelling hit harder than ever. The ground shook like the earth was trying to shrug us off. Trees snapped like matchsticks, and the snow rained down in great sheets from the canopy above. We huddled low, helmets pressed tight, ears ringing. I thought, this is it. This is the end. But the barrage stopped. Silence fell again, heavy and absolute. And then came the sound. Boots crunching snow, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Movement! Someone hissed. Rifles clicked. We aimed into the dark, eyes straining. Shapes emerged from the tree line. Gray coats blending with the night, rifles glinting. The Germans were coming. The firefight that followed wasn't like the day battles. In the night, you didn't see the enemy. You felt them. Muzzle flashes lit the snow like lightning, shadows jerking and twisting. Bullets cracked past so close you felt the heat of their passage. I fired until my rifle jammed, fingers numb as I tried to clear it. Men shouted, screamed, cursed, prayed. One of them, Russo, the kid from Brooklyn, was hit. He dropped into the snow, clutching his stomach. I crawled to him, dragging him back behind a tree. His eyes were wide. His breath ragged white steam. "Don't let me die out here, Sarge," he whispered. I lied to him. I told him he'd be fine, that the medics would patch him up. But I saw the wound. I knew. We both knew. He gripped my hand until his strength gave out. When it was over, I closed his eyes with frozen fingers. By dawn, the attack had broken. The Germans pulled back, leaving their dead in the snow. We'd held, but barely. The ground around us was littered with shell casings, blood, and bodies. The snow, once white, was stained brown and red. I sat in my hole, rifle across my knees, and realized something. The Germans weren't the only enemy. The cold, the hunger, the despair. They were eating us alive, one man at a time, and still, no reinforcements came. We were shadows in the snow, waiting to disappear. The morning after Russo died, I dug a hole in the frozen ground with the butt of my rifle. It wasn't much, just enough to cover him. The earth was so hard that every strike sent shocks up my arms, but I couldn't leave him lying in the open. Not him, not anyone. I found a letter in his breast pocket when I searched for his tags. The paper was soft, worn from being opened 100 times. It was from his kid sister back home in Brooklyn. She'd drawn little doodles in the margins. Hearts, stars, the Statue of Liberty. I couldn't bring myself to read the words. That was his last tether to home. I folded it carefully, slipped it back into his jacket, and covered him with frozen dirt until only a small mound marked where he lay. I wanted to say something. Words of comfort, a prayer, but nothing came. The cold had frozen the prayers in my chest, so I just stood there, staring at the mound of snow and dirt, and promised myself I'd remember his name. That was all I had left to give him. That day, the shelling eased. Not gone, but lighter. Almost like the Germans were catching their breath, too. It gave us time to count the living, patch the wounded, and scrape together what little ammo we had left. Big Tom O'Reilly found half a crate of K-rations in a ruined Jeep. We split it 6 ways. A couple bites of chocolate, a pinch of powdered coffee, a square of hard biscuit. It wasn't much, but it felt like a feast. Men talked in hushed voices about Patton. Rumors said his tanks were pushing hard, coming our way. Others said he'd never make it, that we were on our own. I didn't care which was true. Hope, even in whispers, was something. That night I couldn't sleep. My bones ached from the cold, but it was something else that kept me awake. I pulled out a scrap of paper from my pack and a stub of pencil, and I started writing. Not an official letter, just words to my wife, Mary. I told her about the snow, how it fell so heavy it swallowed the world whole. I told her about Russo and how he smiled even when he was scared. I told her about Doc Jensen, who prayed with every man he patched up, even the ones who didn't make it. And I told her that if I didn't come home, she should know that I thought of her every day, that she was the fire that kept me alive. My hand shook as I wrote. Not from fear, but from the cold. I tucked the letter in my jacket close to my heart. Maybe someone would find it if I didn't walk out of Bastogne. The next morning, the snow stopped falling. The sky was a pale, brittle blue, and for the first time in days, sunlight touched the frozen ground. We all stared at it like men seeing a miracle. It didn't warm us, not really, but it reminded us that there was still a world beyond this hell. That afternoon, a courier slipped through the lines. A skinny kid on skis, pale-faced and frostbitten, carrying a satchel stuffed with orders. He brought word that the 101st would hold. No retreat, no surrender. Reinforcements were coming, they swore, but until then it was on us. The men listened, silent, faces hard. We were already holding, we had no choice. But hearing it written and stamped with an officer's seal gave it weight. As night fell again, I reached into my pocket and touched the letter. Russo's words to his sister on one side, mine to Mary on the other. Two fragile pieces of paper carrying the weight of everything we were fighting for. The war wasn't over. The shells would fall again. Men would die again. But for that one night in the frozen stillness of Bastogne, I felt something I hadn't felt since the first shot was fired. I felt like maybe, just maybe, we could hold. By the 5th day, hunger was our shadow. It followed us everywhere, gnawing at our bellies, dulling our minds, making every step feel heavier than the last. We rationed everything. Half a cracker here, a sip of watery coffee there. Some men chewed on leather straps just to trick their stomachs into thinking they'd eaten something. The cold made hunger worse. Your body burned what little fuel you had just to keep your heart beating. Men's faces grew hollow. Eyes sunk deep into frost-bitten sockets. Even Doc Jensen's prayers sounded thinner, like he was running out of words along with food. The Germans shelled us less, but when they did, it was with purpose. A farmhouse we'd been using as a dressing station was obliterated in one blast. Doc pulled 3 men out alive, his hands black with soot, his voice hoarse from shouting for help. We buried the rest in shallow graves behind the barn, the snow covering them like a cruel blanket. At night, the silence was worse than the shelling. It wasn't real silence. The woods creaked, branches groaned under the weight of snow, and sometimes you'd hear distant shouts in German carried on the wind. But inside the foxholes, with the cold pressed against your chest and your stomach clawing itself hollow, that silence felt like the end of the world. One evening, Hendricks leaned close to me, whispering through cracked lips, "Sarge, you think they'll come? Patton's boys?" I wanted to tell him yes, to swear on my life that tanks and trucks full of food and ammo were already rolling our way. But my voice caught. All I managed was, "They'll come." I hoped he couldn't hear the doubt underneath. That same night, a German loudspeaker crackled to life across the line. A voice, smooth and taunting, drifted through the trees in broken English. "Americans, you are surrounded. Your generals have abandoned you. Lay down your arms. You will be treated well. Warm food, warm beds. No more cold, no more dying." The voice went on, promising everything we didn't have. Bread, heat, life. Some men laughed bitterly. Others cursed. A few just stared into the snow, faces unreadable. I clenched my fists until my nails cut my palms. That voice wasn't just talking to us, it was speaking to the hunger in our bellies, the frost in our bones. And I was terrified that one night some desperate soul might listen. The next day, Hendricks didn't wake up. No wound, no shell, no bullet, just gone. His body had given up in the night, worn down by cold and hunger, until there was nothing left. We wrapped him in his blanket and laid him beneath the snow, our faces numb not just from the wind but from grief too heavy to carry anymore. I caught Doc Jensen staring at the sky afterward, lips moving in a prayer I couldn't hear. When I asked him later what he'd said, he shook his head. Not a prayer, just asking God why. There was no answer. That afternoon, Big Tom picked up a weak radio transmission. Scratchy, buried in static, but enough. It was Patton. He was moving. Slowly, desperately, but moving. Relief wasn't here yet, but for the first time in days, hope had a voice louder than the German loudspeaker. We passed the word from foxhole to foxhole. The men clung to it like fire in the snow. Some smiled, cracked lips bleeding as they did. Others wept silently, shoulders shaking in the frozen dark. That night I lay in my hole, letter pressed against my chest. My stomach groaned, my fingers ached, but my heart beat steady. Patton was coming. Maybe not fast enough, maybe not in time. But he was coming. And until he did, we would hold. The night of December 23rd was the darkest I can remember. Not because of the clouds, though the sky was heavy with them, but because of the weight pressing down on us. Hunger, frost, fatigue. It was as if the world itself was closing its fist around Bastogne. The Germans knew we were stretched thin. They pressed harder, probing with small attacks, testing our lines. Short bursts of machine gun fire would erupt in the dark, then silence. Mortar shells dropped without warning, shaking the ground and showering our foxholes with snow and dirt. It wasn't full assault. It was harassment, pressure. They were trying to break us without firing a shot in daylight. By then, we had so little ammo that every bullet felt like a treasure. I told the men, "Don't fire unless you see the whites of their eyes." It sounded like something out of the history books, but it was truth. Every squeeze of the trigger had to matter. That night, Russo crawled into my foxhole, his face pale beneath the grime. "Sarge," he whispered. "I heard Jenkins praying. Not like Jensen's prayers. Different. He was begging. He said he couldn't do this anymore." I didn't answer at first. I knew the feeling. But I also knew what would happen if fear spread like frost through the ranks. I gripped Russo's shoulder hard enough that he winced. "You tell Jenkins he doesn't get to quit. None of us do. Not until Patton's tanks roll through those trees, you hear me?" Russo nodded, but his eyes were wide, and I knew my words hadn't chased away the fear. Later, the Germans tried again with their loudspeaker. Same promises. Same honeyed voice offering bread, fire, and survival. Only this time they played American swing music between their taunts. Songs that reminded us of home, dance halls, jukeboxes, warm summer nights. It was cruel. Men sat in silence, listening. I saw tears freeze on O'Reilly's cheeks as he stared at the snow. That's when Doc Jensen climbed up out of his hole, standing tall in the moonlight. His breath steamed in great clouds as he shouted across the field, "You can keep your bread and your beds. We've got something you'll never understand." The Germans shouted back in laughter, mocking him. But Jensen didn't stop. He raised his Bible high, his voice ringing out, raw and unshaken. "We have each other. We have faith, and we have a God who hasn't forgotten us." For a moment, even the forest was silent. Just his words hanging in the frozen air. Then the Germans opened fire, a short, vicious burst of machine gun rounds snapping through the branches overhead. Jensen dropped into the snow, unhit but shaken. He crawled back into his hole, face white, lips trembling. None of us said a word. But in our hearts we felt it. His defiance had given us something. A spark. Hours dragged on. The cold deepened until it felt like knives stabbing into our bones. Men dozed in fits, jerking awake whenever a shell landed too close or a twig snapped in the darkness. Every shadow looked like a German crawling toward our lines. Every gust of wind carried voices that weren't there. Near dawn, Hendricks' empty foxhole still stared back at me from across the line, snow drifting over where we'd buried him. I realized then just how thin the line between life and death had become. One missed heartbeat, one long night, one step too slow. And you were gone. But somehow we endured. We were ragged, starving, freezing, and half broken. But we endured, because surrender, no matter how sweetly whispered in the dark, wasn't in us. Not yet. And as the gray light of morning seeped through the clouds, I felt something shift. A distant rumble, low and steady, carried through the earth. Not shellfire, not thunder, something heavier. Tanks. Patton was close. The morning of December 24th didn't bring warmth. It didn't bring food, but it brought something better. Hope. The rumble we'd felt in the earth grew louder as the sun clawed weakly through the gray sky. At first we thought maybe it was our minds playing tricks, the way hunger made you hear things that weren't there. But then, faintly at first, came the sound. Engines. Diesel engines. Shermans. Russo whispered, his face pale, his lips cracked. "Has to be Shermans." I wanted to believe him, but doubt gnawed at me. What if it was German armor? What if the rumble was the last sound we ever heard? We waited. Every second was a hammer on the nerves. Then through the trees to the south came the unmistakable clatter of treads and the growl of American engines. Olive-drab steel rolling through the snow. White stars painted bold on their hulls. It was them, Patton's Third Army. Men stumbled out of their foxholes, half delirious, cheering with what voices they had left. Some wept openly, tears freezing on their cheeks. The Shermans pushed forward, infantrymen alongside them, faces haggard but determined. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I let myself breathe. Relief washed over us like a tide. But it wasn't simple joy. It was messy, complicated, because survival had come at a price. Too many empty foxholes gaped along the line. Hendricks, little Jimmy, half a dozen others whose names I still can't say without my throat tightening. Patton's men brought supplies, food, blankets, ammunition. When I bit into the first piece of bread, it was like tasting life itself. But guilt rode alongside it. Hendricks would never taste this bread. Jimmy would never see the tanks rolling in. That night, as we huddled around a small fire, the first we dared light in days, I realized something. We hadn't won. We hadn't triumphed. We'd endured. That was all. And sometimes endurance was the greatest victory you could hope for. Doc Jensen, his hands shaking from exhaustion, bowed his head and whispered a prayer. Not for ourselves, but for the ones who didn't see this day. His voice was soft, breaking at times, but it carried through the circle of hollow-eyed Marines. Lord, thank you for carrying us through the fire. Thank you for strength when ours was gone. And thank you for the men we lost who gave everything so we could see this morning. May we never forget them. The fire popped. Snowflakes drifted down, melting as they touched our helmets. For a long time, none of us spoke. Then Big Tom, his massive frame hunched in the firelight, broke the silence. "Sarge," he said, his voice rough, "what do we tell people back home when they ask about Bastogne?" I looked into the flames, watching them lick and curl. I thought of Hendricks' frozen foxhole, of Jimmy's laughter before it was silenced, of Jensen's trembling faith. "Tell them the truth," I said finally. "Tell them it wasn't about glory, or medals, or speeches. It was about holding on. One more night, one more hour, one more breath. That's what won Bastogne." The men nodded. Quiet agreement. Not triumph, but understanding. Because in that frozen hell, surrounded by steel and fire, we'd learned the hardest lesson of war. Sometimes victory doesn't look like banners or parades. Sometimes it looks like survival. And for us, on that Christmas Eve in 1944, survival was miracle enough. When morning came on Christmas Day, the snow had stopped. The sky above Bastogne was still gray, heavy with clouds, but it felt different. Less like a tomb, more like a shield. We could hear the distant thunder of tanks still moving, artillery still firing, but here in the foxholes we felt lighter, not safe, never safe, but alive. I walked the perimeter that morning, boots crunching over frozen ground, rifle slung heavy over my shoulder. I passed the empty foxholes first, the ones that belonged to Hendricks, Jimmy, and the others who'd fallen. Each was a reminder, a scar carved into the earth. No one filled them in. It didn't feel right, as though leaving them hollow was our way of honoring the men who once filled them, the men who endured with us. I found Big Tom, hunched over, cradling his radio like it was a child. His lips moved silently. Whether in prayer or memory, I couldn't tell. I left him to it. Jensen was tending to the wounded, his hands raw and trembling but steady. Russo leaned against a shattered tree, his eyes red-rimmed but sharp. Still watching, still ready. These men weren't just Marines anymore. They were brothers. Bound not by blood but by suffering, by survival. Later that day, a chaplain arrived with Patton's men. He gathered us under the broken branches of a blasted oak and spoke of faith, courage, and sacrifice. Some bowed their heads. Some stared blankly into the snow. But when he asked us to pray, every man joined hands, even those who hadn't prayed a day in their lives. I remember the cold of Russo's hand in mine, the quiet strength of Big Tom's grip. I remember closing my eyes and whispering words I wasn't sure I believed. And yet, in that moment, belief didn't matter. What mattered was that we were together, that we remembered. That night, as we huddled once more around the faint glow of a fire, I thought back to something Doc Jensen had said. "Lord, thank you for carrying us through the fire." He was right. We hadn't carried ourselves. We'd been carried by faith, by each other, by something greater than any one man. When people ask about Bastogne, I don't tell them about the tanks or the snow or even Patton's rescue. I tell them about the foxholes, about the frozen nights, about the prayers whispered through cracked lips, drifting upward into a sky that refused to clear. Because that's the truth of it. Bastogne wasn't won by steel alone. It was won by men who refused to break, by men who clung to each other when everything else was stripped away, by men who whispered prayers in the snow and lived to see another sunrise. And that's why I tell this story. Not for myself, not even for the men beside me, but for the ones whose foxholes remain empty, So if you've listened this far, remember them. Say their names when history forgets, because survival isn't enough, not unless the story survives too. This was Bastogne, the frozen hell we endured, the prayer in the snow that carried us home.